Ladies and gentlemen, this is the second of the two panels that we have focusing on South Africa. At times we'll raise new areas because we're looking at mining for the future, and at times we might even pick up some of the key points that were just made because they're worth re-emphasising in that sense. Our panel today, of course, having been the moderator last time, is Roger Baxter, who's the CEO of the Minerals Council of South Africa. Molefi Matuku, he joins us. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Council for Mineral Technology, known as Mintech. Ernst Muller joins us. He's Senior Associate ESG and Natural Resources for Herbert Smith Freehills. He works with Peter Leon, and I think it's not too far to reach to say that Peter and Ernst played a major role in Saudi Arabia's mining code framework. So they have a pretty good relationship there. And finally, we've got Anna Poborezhna, who's the Chief Executive Officer and founder of ClearHub. I might just add that prior to us coming up here on stage today, we had, where we could, some online video interactions. And one of those was one of the most amazing moments I ever had, because for Anna to get onto that call, she had to leave her home in Kiev, in Ukraine, and make her way down to a petrol station that had the internet. And there she appeared on the screen in battle fatigues and a black beanie. She looked all the part, but to go to that extent, of course, mostly lives in London, but is a very proud Ukraine person, and we're with you on that, mate. We are really with you. So I might take a seat and we will get this rolling. Roger was moderator of the last session, but I asked him that if he might perhaps start with an overview on state of the nation in respect of minerals industry in South Africa. I realise some of these areas were covered, but I'm sure that Roger has some revelations for us. Remember, we're looking at the future.
So Gavin, thanks very much. And yes, South Africa is a minerals treasure trove. It's a country which has a very well-developed mining sector. It is a sector that has a very big contribution footprint in the economy, probably accounting for as much as 20% of GDP, 50% of exports. And that's a number that resonates very much with many of the other major mining jurisdictions like Australia, Canada, and others. And it's a sector which has a very, very big human footprint, a footprint that has a big impact on the number of people that receive their education through the sector. We spend approximately $500 million a year investing in people. We support our universities. We have 3 major mining universities. The minister keeps on telling me that we need to build a university in Limpopo. That's something that we'll have to take back to our chief executives on the board of the Minerals Council. But to highlight, we have a number of universities that are in the top 50 in the rankings of the top mining engineering universities. And unlike a country like Australia, where you have the mining faculties in places like on the East Coast, up in Brisbane being closed down, in South Africa we are producing a surplus of mining engineers who do find their way into the rest of the world. And there's not many mining companies around the world that don't have South Africans working in one way or another. So a very capable private sector, great centers of excellence in various aspects of our, and I think this is what we're going to really talk about today, and I won't say much about them, but in areas like geoscience, and then also in terms of minerals processing, and in our universities. We have the Mandela Mining Precinct, which is a precinct which we've just established with government over the last few years, where we are co-funding collaborative research on mining, and that's not actually found in many other countries in the world. Even in Australia, there's not a collaborative co-funding model. It's government doing a bit of work, particularly through the CSIRO, and companies doing a lot of their own work on the RD&I side. So I make that highlight because we're focusing on very specific issues, particularly about how we are going to go through this just energy transition and how we're going to be able to produce the minerals that are critical to enabling the world to meet its Paris ambition of zero net carbon or greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So it's a really important sector. We do have our challenges. We do have our Challenges on the energy front, again, learning from what the Saudis are doing through this collaboration is critical. We have different other areas around the legislative front, Gavin, that I think are important to talk about, where on the royalty side, for example, South Africa has an EBIT-based profit royalty formula in place. It obviates the need for any discussion around super profit taxes. It's stable, it's predictable, and I'm talking about on the royalty side, just as an example. And we've had discussions with a number of country governments about how they could adopt that system, because ad valorem royalty systems are the most damaging to the mining sector, particularly to marginal mining companies. So again, just to highlight a number of the points, but let me stop there because I think the previous panel covered quite a bit.
Right. I must say as an Australian that you hit probably the number one raw nerve for the mining industry, and that is training and education, particularly in the universities. I have my colleague here, Professor Richard Shoddy, and he would share with me that concern in Australia. There are courses that are closing down because we just cannot get people to study them. So if you'd like to send them over, we'd be more than welcome in that respect. Roger, are there any other building blocks that you wanted to mention before we move on? Because I want to cover another aspect in a moment, which is the LAW, Ernst, and then the LORE with Anna. But first.
So Gavin, I mean, if you think about the building blocks, having a very capable private sector that's evolved over time, and a globally renowned private sector is a critical building block. Having in place a stable, predictable, competitive regulatory framework is obviously key. But just remember that in the last 25 years, we've had significant regulatory reform in South Africa. It's not perfection. There are gaps, there are challenges, and we've been working on those. We do have, we've had historically a very reliable electricity supply. I mean, South Africa does have over 60% of sub-Saharan Africa's installed electricity capacity. But we've had some challenges in keeping that reliable, and we're working on the solutions. And in the past 6 months, we've had probably the biggest structural reforms that we've seen in South Africa in the last 20 years, with the reforms that have taken place on liberalizing the energy sector and enabling the private sector to come to the table to invest in renewable energy projects. So those are some of the building blocks, but one of the other building blocks is obviously on the skills and the human capital front. And on that particular front, our universities we do sponsor our universities. We actually do fund what we call subvention programs to keep our lecturers at the universities to make sure that the quality remains high. And we are subventing probably 70% of the students in mining engineering courses, just as a practical example of what we're doing from a mining company perspective.
Before I move on to the LAW and the LORE, do any of our other panellists have anything they'd like to add on the building blocks that they see when we're looking at the future of mining in South Africa? Anything else that you'd want to add? Please, Anna. Oh, there's one there.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me here. Coming from the challenging jurisdiction myself, I see a lot of parallels between South Africa and Ukraine. Firstly, it's titanium economies. It's unique countries which position themselves, which can provide not only the national security, but also global security, because of the titanium value chains that they can develop end to end, and can develop the circular economy around that, but it's not the end. What they can also develop, the regenerative economies around that, given that all the opportunities are in the country. So we're talking here from their exploration, production, processing of the ilmenite and other ores, and of course recovering the materials from the current mineral sands, which are currently has leftovers in the waste. So we're talking not only, we're talking here about the closing the loops and delivering the alternatives around the low carbon materials and low carbon end products. End products in the titanium, we're talking about the sponge, and I think it's untapped opportunity in South Africa. And of course, the pinnacle would be the metal powder. And again, I don't see it as an end point for South Africa. South Africa has one of the best university base and one of the best diasporas in the world that can unite and collaborate efforts around taking South Africa to the next level and developing not only the solar panels, which have been discussed around now in the Limpopo areas, but actually taking the challenge and developing the electronics and the chips. And this is what we call the regenerative economy. This is what we call the closing loops. And if someone thinks it's impossible, I would like to remind that the largest plane in the world, the cargo plane, was built by Ukrainians. It calls Mriya. Mriya translates in English, dream. The first thing that was destroyed in our war that we are experiencing right now, the dream. That plane, that largest, the only one plane. And it was symbolically, because someone thought that by destroying the dream, they would destroy their identity. And they didn't, because it's revival. And that's what I see right now, a big parallel in South Africa. Reviving South Africa identity, culture, and stating it globally, that it's actually the powerhouse and the global security house in the world, having been blessed with those value chains of titanium and other ores, which currently have a potential for the further development, and collaborating with countries like Saudi Arabia on co-developing those value chains.
Okay, thanks, Anna. Ernst or Malifi, did you want to add anything on the building blocks as we look to the future? We're fine there? Okay, LAW. We'll look at that in that sense. Ernst, interesting the background that you have living in South Africa, but how you've played such a role in Saudi Arabia. We'll get to that in a moment, because you might have some learnings or lessons or those type that we could look at. But first off, if we look at South Africa's mineral law regime, which aspects of the framework represent what we term as best practice, and which aspects require maybe a bit of attention?
Thank you, Gavin, and thank you for having me today, ladies and gentlemen. I must caveat this, that I am an eternal optimist, and I have my minister sitting in the audience today as well, so I must tread carefully. I really liked it when Minister Mantashe said that we must remember that South Africa has got a very well-established mining sector. It's been around for at least a century, which means that we have a century worth of experience, and the same counts for the legal regime as well. If we think about the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, it was promulgated in 2004, which means we have 20 years of experience there. So if we think about best practices, we understand that according to the Fraser Institute in Canada, that a mining sector is conducive to investment if the framework in which the mining activities take place are premised on certainty and predictability. And although our mining laws do require may require some improvement to accord with international best practice developments that have taken place over the last 2 decades, what is true is that because we have been running the same mining system for at least 2 decades, that there is a sense of certainty and predictability. The mining laws are also imbued with certain requirements which say that if specific requirements are satisfied, the ministry must award a mining right or must award a prospecting right. That does give a sense of certainty, predictability. And then also we must always remember that the mining sector is not just regulated by the mining law. We have ancillary laws that support the mining sector. So the National Environmental Management Act, the Water Act, the labor laws. These laws all date back from 1998, and some of them, like the Labor Relations Act, even earlier. What is very important about them, ladies and gentlemen, is we think about the increasing emphasis on ESG. These laws have inscribed ESG principles and requirements into South Africa's laws for more than 2 decades now. So while the world thinks about what it means to have a sound, sustainable mining sector, South Africa's laws have been advocating sound, sustainable mining practices for at least 2 decades. An easy example there is the duty of care under our National Environmental Management Act, which says that if you own a piece of land, or you operate on the land, or you are in possession of the land, if you inflict any form of harm on the land, you have the responsibility to rehabilitate and remediate the environment. That's a core ESG principle. That's a core principle that is part of sustainable business practices. The same would apply to sound community management practices. under our Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, before the government officials are allowed to issue a permit, they must, a party applying for the license must embark on an extensive public consultation process. That means engaging with communities. That means giving communities a voice, hearing what they're saying and ensuring that their views are expressed in your management practices. This means that ESG is part of South Africa's laws. It's been part of South Africa's laws for at least 2 decades, which means that South Africa has got a well-established platform for mining companies to operate. I did caveat by saying that I'm an eternal optimist, though. So I think the one bit where South Africa could learn comes with the implementation of the laws. Now, as always, South Africa is a developing economy. It's a very big country. It's a country that exists in opposites, from people who are incredibly rich to people who are incredibly poor, and the government must, of course, cater for all of their needs. But I think in the mining sector, what we found working with some of the mining companies across the sector is that they often find it difficult cutting through all the different levels of red tape. Again, our government is doing fantastic work in the infrastructure space where, for example, with green hydrogen, the government has announced pathways on how they can expedite the administrative process that culminates in the provision of the licenses. And I think the same could be used in the mining space. And as we heard from the previous panel, that many of the backlogs are already being addressed. So what I'd like to say, Gavin, is let's watch the space. Let's stop being negative and pessimists. Let's all work together. And as Anna said, let's turn these challenges into fantastic opportunities.
Wonderful, wonderful. I must say that listening to that the first session on South Africa, what the panel had to say and what the Minister had to say, I found as exciting, visionary, and a lesson for many others, including my own country, on that basis. But I did say I was looking at LAW, and I'd also look to Anna to LAW in that sense, or LORE, which is the other side. So generally for our industry, and we're looking at the future, and in some context, for South Africa, what does it take to build trust and constructive agreement, as you see it, Anna?
Well, in the UK, there's a term called social contract. And UK has a long history of establishing those social contracts with communities. When Margaret Thatcher left the legacy here, it was not the just transition. Since then, UK has learned many hard lessons. What is just transition? And when I've been reviewing a stack of policies that South Africa has developed, and I don't look at the mining industry in separation from the infrastructure industry, because those come together. And what I found out, and it was absolutely fascinating, South Africa has one of the best documented just transition policy in the world. That's a very serious commitment, and I think a lot of countries, including in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, can learn from that document. It's very practical, it's very pragmatic. What is not yet properly done to the full extent is implementation of that. And I think this is what we would like to see. And how to do that is a combination of the digital infrastructure. So we need a really proper engagement with community, as has been mentioned here. And then that document must be combined with the regional economic development policies. So being specific, Limpopo region, again, which I've reviewed, has 2 industrial parks. One is been presented earlier, and then there is LAPE as well. Both are set around on the areas which are surrounded by the dump sites. The dump sites, one of few of them, occupy quite a significant amount of area, 100 hectares. 100 hectares. Imagine how many houses you can build, or what type of manufacturing facility you can build. That sits literally on the board of municipality with their proper infrastructure in place. So it's a distressed asset recovery program. So we don't look at the mining as a mining. We look with the question in mining, what is the life after death? But we can say here, what is the life after the mine? What is the business continuity? And South Africa has all those documents developed. The documents on the future jobs is there. That was fascinating. The medical geology, I've never heard of such job. It exists in South Africa on paper. The biotech jobs, detailedly described on the paper in South Africa. Limpopo economic development and industrial parks are very well described. The eco-industrial parks, UNIDO papers, and the presentations of such are one of the best of the world. The improvement based on the 51 studies has been done that South Africa has a potential of increasing the efficiency of such as 20%. Imagine 20% upside. We're not even talking here about the risk management. We're talking about the 20% of the opportunity. And then we would need to convert it in the monetary revenue streams. How much money we can make here? And that's a question. If we're not going to only look at the risk management, but also on the opportunity, then we increase in the pie. It's a donut economics 101. And that's what I'm focused. And this is where we need to have a sort of a unity and monitoring mechanisms, but the risk mechanisms and the quality assurance mechanism on the ground to ensure the certainty for investors. Because talking about the investment, once we have economic and financial model, is still a challenge. The index of doing business of South Africa is not the best in the world. It somewhere sits in between. South Africa, unfortunately, is number 84 of ease of doing business of over 160 countries. There's improvement. In terms of the mining jurisdiction, I'll be quoting here the Institute of Fraser. It's number 10 from the bottom of the investment attraction. So how I see it, rather than climbing point by point, flip it around and become top 10.
Yep.
There's a leapfrog.
And I think the minister addressed that very clearly when he said that the mining industry had played a major role in keeping the economy strong in South Africa after the pandemic. And he said, if I read it correctly, that this was in many ways quite an important realisation for government as to how to look at this again. So you can clearly see that these matters are being addressed and carried forward in that area. I was going to ask another question of you on circular economy because it fascinates me, but I'll come back to that in a moment. Molefi, Mintech. You covered there that South Africa has significant resources. Everyone knows that. It was spoken about before. And it has an opportunity to play a significant role in, and again I'm talking to the future especially, in the critical minerals and global battery value chain. We're talking here exploring upstream, midstream, downstream, and localising the value chains on critical battery storage is a major consideration for everyone and especially for South Africa. On that front, Molefi, could you touch upon, please, the upstream opportunities for mineral beneficiation and processing in South Africa? And I'll have a follow-up question to that.
Thanks, Gavin. The issue of critical minerals has been spoken about a lot in this conference. What I like to do is just put it in context. If you look at South Africa, and the minister spoke about the numbers, when it comes to, I'll just focus on battery storage minerals, specifically in South Africa. You look at fluorspar and manganese. South Africa is ranked first globally in terms of reserves. You look at vanadium, we are ranked second. Titanium fourth, nickel fifth, phosphate sixth. We do have deposit of rare earth elements. Now, if you look at SADC and you look at Zimbabwe, lithium, and you take South Africa and Zimbabwe on PGM, South Africa holds close to 88% of PGMs globally. You add Zimbabwe, is more than 90%. Then you can look at Namibia, you can look at Mozambique on graphite, and you can add them, SADC. Now the picture on critical minerals becomes even more attractive if you add SADC countries. Now, Roger spoke about the long history in processing. Okay, South Africa is very strong on refining, but the issue with battery minerals, they require exceptional purity. And South Africa has been building a capacity to assist industry in terms of producing these precursor minerals. Mintech, I see my colleagues are there. they've been doing a lot of work, and we're seeing even companies like the Bushveld Minerals, who's mining vanadium, looking at even further producing electrolytes for battery minerals. If I just give you the numbers to indicate the potential in South Africa, we did some studies, and if you look at just production of nickel sulfate in South Africa, the potential, we could easily produce more than 80,000 tons of nickel sulfate, and that will amount to about 5.8 billion just in South Africa. There's that potential. The infrastructure and the expertise do exist in South Africa to do that. If you look at the production of vanadium electrolytes, we're looking at more than 6 million liters that could easily be produced in South Africa. Aluminium, yes, we don't have aluminium resources, but we do produce aluminium in South Africa. Roger will agree to that. 5,000 tons of aluminium foil. We currently, through a company called Halumin, we do produce aluminum foil in South Africa, which is an important component to the battery. You look at the manganese sulfate, 20,000 tons. Graphite, we could. Now, there are many also opportunities for manufacturing in South Africa. So what I'm really putting out there is South Africa is ready in terms of the infrastructure. Mosa spoke about the exploration potential in South Africa. Some of these deposits, like rare earth elements, there's huge potential in South Africa. What we've been seeing is that people are also looking at what you call urban mining, okay? Recycling is becoming very, very key, even on these critical minerals. What we are seeing, for instance, most of our deposits, phosphate deposits, they do have rare earth elements. And we have stockpiles of that, and people are coming back looking at expertise to be able to recover that. And we're working with industry to be able to recover. I was listening to the Minister of Saudi Arabia saying their crude oil has rare earth elements. So some of this cherry picking that happened before on these minerals, while revisiting the stockpiles, and South Africa, we are seeing a lot of that happening. And we are saying on critical minerals, SADC has a great potential for people to look at it. Thanks.
Okay, Roger, did you want to add something on that front there?
Yes, I just wanted to add, and actually ask Molefi to add to it, which is, I think one of the critical building blocks that I didn't cover is this concept of partnership between government and the industry. And it's not only government itself in terms of the regulator, it's also these science institutes. And if I look at Mintech, I mean, we do have 88% of the world's platinum reserves in South Africa, proved reserves. We would never be able to mine the UG2, what we call the UG2 ores, if we hadn't worked in partnership with Mintech as the mining companies to produce the processing technology to enable us to process that into refined platinum, which we then refine in South Africa to 4/9 platinum, 4/9 purity. So just maybe a comment from his side
Yes,
on the
yes, by all
partnership
means,
approach
please.
and the funding approach that they're getting from mining companies working with them.
Okay, Molefi, could you address that? But at the end of that, could you also give us a brief little insight into the capabilities of Mintech? In other words, for Mintech, I've got to give them a free ad. I have to do that. So.
Thanks for that, Gavin. Maybe let me use this example, if you allow me, Roger. If I don't use this one, partnership between government and industry. And I'll use we recently, government launched what we call Hydrogen Valley, okay? And there is a partnership between government and the mining houses, where we're looking at concentrating all hydrogen applications under one roof. And what came out, and we have identified 8 projects. One that I'd like to mention is the Anglo Platinum one at Mogalakwena. This is the largest open pit platinum mine in the world, okay? And they use heavy hauling trucks. One truck is about 220 tons, 300 tons, okay? Yeah, 300 tons, okay? Now, they constitute 8% of diesel emissions for Anglo. Now, working with government industry, Anglo retrofitted their diesel truck with hydrogen, a hybrid of hydrogen and fuel cell. Okay? That system is about 210 tons. So the whole truck with load is 510. Now build the ecosystem with electrolyzer. And the beauty about that is that the platinum or PGMs that are required to build the electrolyzer. And that is a good partnership between government and industry to address some of the challenges that we are talking about. And there are many of these projects that will be coming on stream. Thanks
About the core capabilities of Mintech, and are there other organisations that might mirror Mintech in other parts of the world, and even if it's not too early, for Saudi Arabia?
Mintech is an 88-year-old metallurgical research and technology organization. We are very strong on extractive metallurgy, which is our core business. Very strong. We have supported the ferroalloy industry, very strong on smelting, hydrometallurgy, refining. I have my colleagues here, very strong on providing mineralogical and analytical services. Actually, our presence here also is to expand our footprint in Saudi Arabia. We signed some agreements with a few companies here in Australia to be able to, in Saudi Arabia and the kingdom, to really extend our footprint, and also are very strong on measurement and control processes. We operate in more than 45 countries. So we are a global player. We like also, we operate, we like to extend or expand our footprint in the region, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, and the partnership with the Saudis are very important for us to do that as a conduit to the rest of the Middle East. 80
odd years, amazing. Ernst, I just wanted to touch with you on energy transition, and in the context of law LAW, equates in many ways to duties that we have out there. In the context of energy transition, just seeking your view on the duties which rest on the different stakeholders, again it's partnerships, in the mining sector.
Yeah, I think that's an exciting question for someone who practices ESG law, because we appreciate that as a society we're an ecosystem where everybody has a role to play, stretching from communities who would not be victims in the process but who should be partners, to the private sector, who must appreciate that it can't just be a profit-driven model anymore. It has to be a sustainable model at the end of the day, which means that you have to, again, take into consideration all the different E, S, and G factors, which, listening to the conversation between the panelists today, has to rest on transparency, because transparency cultivates accountability, and accountability translates into truth at the end of the day. And then, of course, the role of the government, where Peter and I had a long conversation last night about his panel and whether government should be seen as a competitor or as an enabler at the end of the day, and what the consequences are. And I think from a stakeholder role perspective, governments must be seen as an enabler, to create a platform where the different stakeholders can then engage to grow an economy and a sector in an organic manner. Now, to be an enabler, and that's perhaps a lesson that we learned from the work in Saudi Arabia, the starting point is the law. The law creates a framework, but the framework is only ever the starting point. It shouldn't inspire anything more than getting the right people in the room together and understand where the different boundaries are, what their rights and what their obligations are. And again, that plays back into the role of communities, the role of the private sector, and the role of the different private sector participants, of course. So the miners, the producers, the beneficiaries, the bankers, everybody, and then government, again, being the glue that holds everybody together, and focusing specifically then on these tripartite relationships, which I'm sure Roger will touch on.
Okay. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes. I have two more questions. The first question is for Anna, and the last question will be the one, did I miss anything? So if you wanted to touch on that, you can do it. Anna, I think you're one of the leading lights, as I see it, in harnessing and implementing the practice of circular economy. It's something that we should all understand better. And I thought perhaps you might just give us just a minute or so insight into circular economy and how it works, and then we'll move to the last question.
Thank you. Well, the circular economy global opportunities studies were done and published. Equal in the extractive sector is 3.5 trillion a year. A year with a potential of 87 million jobs creation. Now, let's scale it down to the South Africa scale. What does it mean? It means waste recovery, waste reprocessing, land redevelopment. So from all the way the value chain, there's a new potential value chain, a new potential business line called remine to redevelop. And when I started looking into that and identifying the assets, which are basically waste dumps, no one needs them, no one wants them, it took a very long time to understand what are the elements and what are the right technologies, what are the right universities, academia, and what type of materials we can actually produce in the necessary amount of volumes to make them sellable, and what are the markets. An example of that, there's also a scientific study was done by the Department of Science and Innovation in South Africa, proving that circular economy possesses new potential growth for South African economy. How much is going to be out of 1.1% GDP projection for this year? There's no study to prove that. I think everything in our hands, and the faster we create the investment atlas for brown or black assets, and I mean from the pollution perspective, that the faster we will understand those opportunities. So we need to do some more studies and literally mapping them.
Okay. Last question, while you've got it, Molefi, are there any burning matters that I've missed or that you'd like to raise? This is the forum. You'll have to wait to FMF next year if you miss it now.
I just want to highlight maybe one or two further opportunities in the country in terms of further value addition opportunities. If you, my colleagues will recall that a lot of work was done in South Africa in the 80s on lithium-ion batteries. The infrastructure exists in South Africa to continue to build further lithium-ion batteries in South Africa. There are different components that are being built in the country. So there is a great opportunity there. There is a great opportunity also to look at vanadium redox flow batteries. We have some companies in South Africa like Bushveld Minerals who are already contributing to that. So we conducted studies to make sure that we develop the right environment to invite investors in the space. The last one is our hydrogen and fuel cell program, which has been running in the country for more than 15 years now. We are producing a lot of components in South Africa for fuel cells. Hydrogen, we produce catalysts, membranes. So there is a fertile ground for inviting investors in terms of building further manufacturing activities on fuel cells.
Thanks, Molefi. Ernst, we've probably got 1 minute between us, but if you've got any burning matter that I missed.
Maybe just a message from the next generation, if I can be that bold, and that's I think mining is a long-term process. It survives many political cycles. It will survive all of us. If South Africa's mining sector is going to thrive, we need to do away with the noise. We need to stop talking. We need to get busy.
And I should add there that Dominic Barton, the chairman of Rio Tinto, spoke this morning, and he was asked the question, what is the one burning matter of the future? And he said, for our industry, short-termism. Yeah. It's our biggest concern. Anna, anything you wanted to add before we closed out with Roger?
I would do their planning what we're going to do life after mine and start developing progressive. So progressively, not just mining the minerals, but mining the value outside the minerals and mining the intelligence which South Africa is abundant with.
Fantastic. Roger, last say.
Gavin, thanks. And just what COVID taught us, it was a great catalyst for collaboration. We solve our problems when they say that a problem shared is a problem halved. And one thing that's happened in South Africa's case is that we actually worked incredibly well with government during the COVID period to save lives and save livelihoods. What we're now doing is working with government on really getting South Africa back on the map. And that's been our focal point as the Minerals Council, in collaboration and to deal with all the relative issues that we have challenges on. These solutions are there. It's all about doing. And so we've adopted the slogan, be the change that you want to see in the world. And we are being that change. Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, that's a wonderful note to leave this part of the session covering South Africa. Would you please thank our panellists for their wonderful efforts. Thank you. Now don't go away, because I'll be back in a moment with a spotlight on the winners of the World Cup